There are three types of muscles in your body: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal muscles. Smooth muscles are muscles found mainly in the walls of hollow organs, such as blood vessels and organs of the digestive tract. And these are responsible for involuntary actions, such as moving food through your digestion tract. The second type of muscle is striated muscle found in the heart, which is called cardiac muscle. It's only found in the heart, making most of the heart wall, and it's also responsible for involuntary actions, such as your heart beating. The third type of muscle is skeletal muscle, which is muscle attached to the bones through connective tissues called tendons, and it's responsible for movement. And it's the basic characteristic behind this is a hierarchy of smaller and smaller units, and this is responsible for the motor mechanisms of the body. So there are two contractile systems that help animal cells move. One is through microtubules, which is basically through beating, cilia, and flagella. The second is through microfilaments, which are contractile elements that you think of when you think of muscle cells, and they control amoeboid movement. Your body is made up of antagonistic pairs, so basically there are two muscles that work against each other. For example, in your arm, you have biceps and triceps, and basically when the bicep contracts, the tricep is going to relax, and vice versa. When the biceps relax, the triceps are going to contract. So like I said before, the vertebrae skeletal muscle has a lot of units that just get smaller and smaller. And so we start off with this muscle, and we all know what a muscle looks like, but when you cut into it, the smaller unit of a muscle are muscle fiber bundles, and from there it gets even smaller, and the next unit is called a muscle fiber. And basically, these are just fibers that are just long and parallel, and they're attached to the bones. One defining characteristic that's super interesting is that they have multiple nuclei, which means that there's just a fusion of embryonic cells, and they just have a lot of nuclei. So muscle fibers are made of something called myofibrils, which are cylindrical organelles running the length of the muscle fiber. And they're made of something called myofilaments. And there are two types of myofilaments, thick and thin. That's where the striated appearance of muscles comes from. It's just like the dark and light strands from the myofilaments. So, like I said before, there are thick and thin filaments. Thick filaments are just made of a vast array of myosin molecules, and thin filaments are two strands of actin and one strand of regulatory protein, which are wrapped around each other. Actin is a thin contractile protein filament containing active or binding sites. Myosin is a thick contractile protein filament with something called myosin heads and tails. So going back to myofibrils, so there's a basic repeating contractile unit called sarcomeres, and they're divided into I, A, and H bands, which have Z lines around it. The Z lines are myofibrils that contribute to the visible striations when you look at muscles under a light microscope. And at the end of the sarcomere, there are thin filaments called I bands. And these I bands surround the thick filaments called the A band. And in the middle of the A band, there's something called the H zone, and this is all made of thick filaments. Next, we're going to talk about the sliding filament model, which is used to describe muscle contraction. So basically, when a muscle contraction occurs, the sarcomere shortens, and the thick and thin filaments slide past each other longitudinally, producing an overlap between the thick and thin filaments. So this means that the I bands and the H zones will shrink. This is a muscle contraction. This happens as a result of an interaction between actin and myosin molecules, which make up the filaments. We already know that myosin molecules have circular heads coming out the sides, and they also have tails, and these tails attach to other tails, making the thin filaments. Thick filaments. Ooh, that's confusing. The heads are used to power muscle contractions through reactions, and this is seen when the ATP binds to the myosin heads. So in its low energy configuration, the myosin head really wants to reach the actin in some way, but it can't until an ATP is binds to it. We know that ATP, when it's hydrolyzed, turns into ADP and an inorganic phosphate, and in turn, it releases energy. And this is exactly what happens. The myosin head hydrolyzes the ATP, and this releases energy, making a high energy configuration. As a result, the breakdown of the ATP releases energy, which enables the myosin to pull the actin filaments inwards, and this shortens the muscle. This happens along every myofibril in the muscle cell. So this is the contraction. When the myosin head binds to the actin as a result of ATP, it forms something called a cross bridge. And from that cross bridge, the thin filaments go towards the center of the sarcomere. When the ADP and inorganic phosphate are released, the ones that were hydrolyzed, myosin returns to its low energy configuration, sliding the thin filament. The thin filament, like I said, moves towards the center of the sarcomere, and binding of a new molecule of ATP releases the myosin head from the actin, and from there, a new cycle begins. So when the new ATP attaches, then it goes back to its low configuration. So that's how the cycle keeps going on and on. So that's how you contract your muscles every single time. The energy comes from various sources. Muscle fibers only have a few ATP to power a few contractions. They don't. It's not sustainable in any way. So that's why there are other energy sources to power these contractions. One of them is called creatine phosphate, which makes ATP by moving a phosphate group to ADP. So you're just creating an ATP that will be used by binding to the myosin head, and that will just power the whole system. Another way is glycogen. Glycogen is broken down into glucose, and as we know, the glucose is used in cellular respiration, and that makes large amounts of ATP. So that's where the energy comes from. Next, you're going to learn about the calcium and regulatory proteins part of this process, so just move on to the next page.